It was the kind of house that remembered everything, even when no one else did. The boards groaned with memory, and the wind that slipped through the cracked shutters never stopped whispering names that hadn't been spoken in years. The cabin leaned east, like it was tired of standing up to the sun. Outside, the prairie stretched out like a held breath, all gold and dust and things left unsaid. Inside, silence had weight, not the silence of peace, the silence of absence. A single grave lay just beyond the porch, where wild grass bowed in a permanent hush. Its marker was a crooked piece of wood, the ribbon tied to it long bleached by sun and time. Next to it, a cradle, not inside the house, outside, empty, untouched. A cradle that had never held anything but hope that never came. And yet every morning, without fail, a man left a bundle of firewood at the doorstep, not because someone needed it, not because he expected thanks, but because once long ago someone had, and memory, when it runs deep, becomes habit. He didn't speak to anyone, not anymore. His voice had dried up like the riverbed 2 miles west. His name was said only by those who wanted to warn or wonder. He wore his solitude like a coat he forgot how to take off. His hands were calloused, not from work, but from holding on too long, to things, to people, to shame. No one passed that trail unless they had a reason, and for years, no one did. Until one day the horizon stirred. Dust, rising slow and steady. A woman walking, no hat, no shoes, just dust caked on skin, and the sun wrapped around her like judgment. In her arms, a crying child, not wailing, just that high, sharp kind of cry that pierces more than it begs. And beside them, silence, not the woman's, but the kind that followed her, like a shadow made of stories no one wanted to hear. She didn't knock, she just stood there, eyes hollowed out by miles. The child pressed to her chest like a second heartbeat. She didn't ask for water, or food, or kindness, just stood, as if the wind had finally brought back something it had taken. And he, the man who didn't speak, watched her. Not because she was beautiful, she wasn't, not in the way the world measures such things, but because her silence wasn't empty. It was full of something he recognized, loss. She was branded too wild to marry. People said she fought too hard, spoke too much, laughed too loud, or maybe didn't laugh at all. People always find reasons to exile those who refuse to break the way they're told. But now she wasn't fighting, she was simply arriving. And in that arrival, something shifted. The shutter still moaned, the wind still spoke. But the house, that tired wooden house, held its breath for the first time in years. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin with words. It begins with presence, with the moment someone shows up and doesn't look away, with the sound of a child crying in a place that has only known the sound of grief. That morning, for the first time in a long time, he didn't just leave the firewood, he opened the door. She walked in like the wind had told her where to go, not with boldness, but with the kind of quiet that comes from having nothing left to lose. Her boots were slung over her shoulder, tied with a leather string, as if she'd once tried to carry dignity like baggage and had given up halfway. The child on her hip whimpered, then settled as she stepped onto the worn floorboards. The house creaked around her, not in protest, but in unfamiliar curiosity. Her eyes scanned the space like someone who used to have a home, like someone who remembered where warmth had once lived. She didn't speak, but she moved toward the hearth as if called, set the child down on a wool blanket, removed her coat, and walked to the stove. The man said nothing, just stood near the doorway, watching her like a memory that hadn't happened yet. She boiled water. Her hands moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this many times before, someone who knew that healing began with heat, with care, with doing the small things right. The child reached for the firelight, fingers spreading like they wanted to hold something glowing. She sang then, not in English, not in any language he knew, but it filled the room like incense, like steam, like something soft that climbed up walls and slipped into cracks. When she finished, she folded his old coat, the one that still carried the scent of pine and regret. She didn't ask if it was hers to touch, she just did it, gently, like she was putting something back where it had always belonged. He didn't stop her, couldn't. There was something in the way she moved that made refusal feel like betrayal. That night, she slept on the rug beside the fire, the baby curled into her belly like a comma in a sentence not yet finished. He lay in his bed, eyes open to the ceiling, and listened to the breath of strangers who did not feel like strangers. For the first time in months, maybe years, he did not rise at midnight to walk the perimeter, did not check the locks, did not light the lantern just to feel less alone. He dreamed instead. Nothing vivid, just warmth. Just the sound of a lullaby he didn't know he remembered. And in the dream, the house did not groan. The wind did not weep. In the dream, someone had stayed. The next morning brought a sun too bright to ignore. It filtered through the cracked shutter in long golden slivers, turning dust into dancing light. The baby, now rested, watched the particles with round eyes and sudden joy. A single giggle broke the stillness. It was a laugh so pure, so unexpected, it made the air pause to listen. He stood in the doorway, caught off guard by that sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it echoed deeper than it should have, as if the walls themselves had forgotten how to hold joy. And now they were learning again. The woman was at the stove, stirring something simple. Porridge, maybe. She didn't turn around, but he could tell by the angle of her shoulders that she had smiled. She had begun cleaning, not with urgency, not like someone trying to impress, but with care. She moved toward the corners first, the places no one else bothered to look. She wiped windowsills with her sleeve, brushed cobwebs from behind the cupboard, repositioned a photograph that had leaned crooked for years. He watched her, and he didn't stop her. There was something reverent in the way she moved, as if she were blessing the house rather than tidying it. He found himself waking earlier, not because the chores demanded it, but because he wanted to be near that laughter, that soft, miraculous sound. He would split logs just outside the window and pause, not to rest, but to hear the child laugh at the chickens, at the dog chasing its tail, at nothing at all. Joy, it seemed, didn't need a reason. In the evenings, she hummed while preparing supper. Not always the same melody, but always in the same tone. Low, warm, familiar, like something heard in a dream and forgotten by morning. The house began to respond. Floorboards no longer groaned in protest. The air felt less heavy. Even the kettle seemed to whistle softer. One day he caught himself waiting, listening for the sound of her steps across the floor, the quiet rhythm of presence. That evening, when she didn't come down right away, he felt a tightness in his chest. Not panic, just an ache, the kind that reminds you something matters, the kind that tells you you've let someone in, whether you meant to or not. Grief, he realized, had settled into the bones of the house, into his bones. But now laughter was disarming it, not all at once, not like a thunderclap, but like morning light easing its way into a room that had been closed too long, not asking permission, just arriving. It was the sound of hooves that changed the light in the room, a slow, deliberate rhythm that didn't belong to passing riders or lost ranch hands. He looked up from the stove. She was already at the window, her body tense but still. The baby stopped cooing, as if the silence had returned and the house remembered what it meant to hold its breath. A man approached, well-dressed, not dusty like travelers, clean lines, sharp eyes. He didn't knock either, just dismounted, tied his reins loosely and stood at the gate like someone who expected doors to open before he reached them. When he spoke, he said her name, not the name she gave in this town, but the one buried under all the others. She didn't answer. She stepped back from the window. Her hands didn't shake, but her mouth pressed tight and her eyes darted to the shovel by the porch. The man in the cabin rose slowly, not rushing, not questioning, just stood by the doorway, body angled between her and the world. The stranger spoke again, offered money, too much, folded bills that looked too soft for prairie wind. "For what I lost," he said. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her silence was louder than refusal. The baby whimpered, sensing a storm without thunder. There are some debts no money can repay, some stories no outsider can buy back. He didn't ask her to explain. The man who had opened the door that first morning simply stepped onto the porch, picked up the shovel and leaned it against the doorframe where it could be seen, not as a threat, as a choice. The stranger hesitated, not out of fear, but because something in the stillness unnerved him. Because two people standing in silence, not moving, not flinching, can make even the boldest man question his ground. The offer wasn't repeated. The man mounted again. The wind tugged his coat as he turned back toward the trail. No words followed, just the sound of hooves returning to distance. That night the child slept between them, not because they planned it, but because protection has a way of drawing lines without drawing maps. They ate in silence. But it was a silence filled with understanding. Sometimes the loudest thing two people can say is nothing at all. The morning she left, it didn't rain. It didn't storm. There were no omens in the sky, just a pale light stretching across the floorboards, and the quiet that feels different from sleep. He woke to it, not the sound of her voice, not the baby crying, but to a stillness that felt hollow, too clean. The cradle sat near the hearth now, where the fire reached, but never scorched. Folded on its edge was the baby blanket, the one she had sewn patches into from her coat, the one that carried her scent, her care, her weightless prayers, folded with care, left like a question no one would ever answer. She hadn't left a note, hadn't taken the firewood he stacked, The stew from the night before was still warm, untouched. Her boots were gone. Her presence erased, but not hidden, not in shame, in decision. For 3 days, he did not speak, did not ride out. He sat by the door each morning, cradling the blanket like a fragile truth. The baby's cry did not echo anymore, only in memory, only when he closed his eyes too long. On the 4th day, he boiled water. On the 5th, he set the table for 3. He began to walk the perimeter again, not to keep danger out, but to feel the air, to remind himself that the world still turned. The fence needed mending. The barn door leaned. He touched each thing with hands that remembered what they were for. He moved like a man relearning the shape of waiting. And then one evening dust rose again, far off, a shimmer in the late light. His chest tightened, but he didn't move, just placed a hand on the doorframe and stood. Because sometimes leaving is not abandonment. It's breathing space, it's choosing, it's knowing you'll be missed, not chased. And sometimes the greatest act of presence is leaving behind something you loved, folded neatly near the fire. She didn't arrive like before. There was no collapse at the doorstep, no child wailing, no desperate silence, just a figure walking steady and slow through the twilight dust. Her shoulders were straighter, her pace deliberate. The sun behind her stretched her shadow ahead, reaching the porch before she did. He saw the scar before he saw her eyes. It cut across her brow, down past her temple. He didn't ask what caused it. He didn't need to. The child in her arms clung tighter, older now, but not grown. Her hair was shorter, her silence deeper, but it was not shame she carried, it was knowledge. She stepped onto the porch and didn't look for permission. She didn't speak, neither did he. They simply met eyes, just long enough to say what language cannot hold. Then she walked inside, her feet sure, her breath calm. The child reached out to him, not with fear, but with a whisper of recognition. That night, they ate stew. She didn't cook, and he didn't finish. She sat closer than before. The air was thick, not with tension, but with things understood too deeply to be named. The wind moved the shutter, but the sound didn't haunt anymore. It hummed. Before dawn, he placed a horseshoe above the doorframe, not for luck, not for protection, for closure, for memory, for the quiet covenant that had been made without words. Forgiveness is not a ceremony. It doesn't ask to be witnessed. It exists in how a man fills her cup without being asked, in how she sweeps the floor without being told, in how the child sleeps between them, safe, in how neither one ever says, "I forgive you." Proximity became their language. She slept by the fire now, though the bed was empty. He sat beside the cradle again, not because the child needed watching, but because the act meant something. They didn't ask where the other had been. They only stayed. And in that staying, something new grew where silence once ruled. Some threads don't fray, they bind, not tightly, not painfully, but with enough strength to hold two lives gently together, even if neither one planned it. Morning came not with noise, but with presence, the kind of presence that settles in after the fire has burned low, and no one needs to speak to know they are home. He woke not because of sound, but because of weight, the weight of peace, unfamiliar but welcome. She was outside, her hands deep in the soil, not just planting, but tending. There was something about the way she moved now. No urgency, no shame, only intention. The child sat near the porch, watching ants carry crumbs 10 times their size. Neither called for the other. They were simply there. He no longer visited the grave at dawn. He went when the air grew heavy, when the wind shifted in a way that pressed memory against his chest. Not every day, not out of duty, but as one visits an old friend, someone you carry in your marrow. The cradle now stood by the wall beside the stove. It no longer held absence, it held firewood, stacked with care, a ritual born of loss, repurposed through use. Every log placed like an offering to the silence that once ruled the room. It rocked once in the breeze, then stilled, and no one needed to touch it again. There were no declarations between them, no talk of futures or pasts, but the porch was swept, the roof mended, a fence post stood straighter, and her chair moved closer to his by the fire each night, without fanfare, without question. Some things don't need to be named to be true. The house hadn't changed, the shutter still let the wind through, but now the wind carried new smells, of stew, of earth, of something growing, something mended, something stayed. And sometimes that's all healing asks for. Not loud victories, not perfect endings, just presence and a cradle that now held weight.